Landing a big fish as they continue to finish up their new look offensive coaching staff. The Seahawks have brought in a 3-time Super Bowl winner, continuing to prioritize the run game and coaching the offensive line. We'll be breaking it all down here on our latest installment of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on our Tuesday episode, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in, whether you're in Black Diamond, Washington, or Athens, Georgia. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Seahawks continue to fill out their coaching staff, now bringing in a 3-time Super Bowl winner to help Klint Kubiak, and a run game that struggled quite a bit last season. We're going to dive into a key offensive lineman that may or may not be coming back as he heads towards free agency. And speaking of free agency, it's all about the wideouts today. Wideouts are wanted. We'll be breaking down some receivers that could interest the Seahawks heading into free agency next month. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Up to this point, we have seen a trend under new offensive coordinator Klint Kubiak in Seattle where familiarity matters. We've already seen John Benton being hired as the new offensive line coach, Andrew Janocko as the quarterback coach, Kennedy Palomalo being retained as a running back coach. All three of those coaches have previously been on the same staff as Klint Kubiak. And now that number grows to 4, actually to 5, with the addition of Justin Outen officially announced today as well. 5 coaches that previously have worked with Klint Kubiak, number 5 being the man himself, Rick Dennison, a 3-time Super Bowl champion. All 3 of those titles coming with the Denver Broncos. He was a special teams coordinator for the first 2 during the end of John Elway's run. And then in 2015, when the Broncos won it in Peyton Manning's final season, he was the offensive coordinator for the Broncos that season. Rob, we're talking about one of the most illustrious assistant coaches that is still coaching in the NFL today. Dennison has a really impressive track record. As I mentioned, he coached special teams back in the day, but he's been an offensive line coach, an offensive coordinator, a run game coordinator, most recently a senior offensive assistant that had a big impact for the New Orleans Saints last year, working with Klint Kubiak. He coached under Gary Kubiak in Denver and Houston previously. This really does feel, at least in my opinion, this is the cherry on top of the sundae in terms of bringing in experienced coaches that can really help Klint Kubiak find success in Seattle.
Yeah, I think this is a signing that Seahawks fans should be very excited about. You know, we've talked a lot about the fact that Mike Macdonald leaned heavily on Leslie Frazier a year ago. Of course, when he had to, when he and his wife were having their first child, then it was Leslie Frazier that wound up serving as the head coach in Mike Macdonald's absence. I think that Klint Kubiak just got his Leslie Frazier on offense with Rick Dennison. Look, the man is 66 years old, so this is a older coach. You know, so many of the coaches that Seattle has brought in. You mentioned Justin Outen. I mean, Justin Outen is 41 years old. So again, there is a significant difference in age and experience here, but still, when you look at the track record, I mean, I remember watching Rick Dennison as a linebacker for the Denver Broncos all those years ago. I mean, played in the league for, 8, 9, 10 years at that linebacker position. For him to become as respected as an offensive mind as he has become, that really is a testament to his brain, frankly, and as well as just his, just his work ethic. I mean, this is a guy who's had stops with the Broncos, as you mentioned, the Texans, as you mentioned, but also the Ravens, the Bills, the the Jets, the Vikings, and then most recently the New Orleans Saints, which is, of course, where he most recently worked with Klint Kubiak. So I'm excited about this addition to the Seahawks. I just think that anytime that you are working with as many young offensive linemen as the Seahawks have, we talked about this in yesterday's show, Corbin, the Seahawks have invested draft picks in 7 offensive linemen over the last 3 years. I do think that this is another indication that the Seahawks are not necessarily looking to draft or sign different offensive linemen. They are leaning in heavily in terms of coaches to try to improve the offensive linemen that they already have on the roster rather than replace them. Rick Dennison, you are getting one of the best in the business. And between he, who is going to officially be the running game coordinator and a senior offensive advisor, as well as Justin Alton, who we've talked about before, who's not going to be the run game specialist and assistant offensive line coach, I do think that these are 2 home run signings by the Seahawks as far as coaches. And, frankly, at this point, I don't think that it's more, I think it's more about Seattle getting better coaches and coaxing more impressive play from their prospects rather than trying to sign new players or draft new players. Because let's be real, how many times do you see an NFL team have any type of success with a rookie offensive lineman, or even frankly with a veteran free agent offensive lineman? Really, where you see the adjustments and the improvement made is usually when you have quality coaching helping those young players really become the best players they possibly can be.
If you're looking for a coach that can jumpstart a bad run game, I don't know that there is a guy that has a more impressive resume than Rick Dennison brings to the Seattle Seahawks. Just look at his past history, Rob. In 10 seasons as an offensive coordinator in the NFL, he's had 6 teams that finished in the top 10 in rushing yardage. The Broncos in 06 and 07. He had 3 consecutive years with the Houston Texans when he's working with Gary Kubiak, where they finished in the top 10, including rushing for nearly 2,500 yards in 2011. His lone season in Buffalo, Josh Allen's rookie year, they finished 6th in rushing yards that season. And then the 2 years he was a run game coordinator in Minnesota, they finished 6th and 5th. This guy has hit nearly 70% in terms of having top 10 rushing attacks in his career when he's been an offensive coordinator or a run game coordinator in the NFL. Again, that is as impressive of a resume as you are going to find. And just kind of piggybacking on a discussion that we had last week when we were talking about Justin Alton. At the time, it was being reported that Alton was going to be the run game coordinator. But with Rick Dennison now coming in, he is going to take that mantle, and Justin Alton is going to be the run game specialist. So he's going to be working with the running back coach as well as the run game coordinator and Klint Kubiak. It is clear the Seahawks are putting as many eggs into the run game basket as they can. When this team finished 28th in rushing yards and 29th in attempts last season, that is not going to be the weakness of this offense this upcoming season. Now with the emphasis that they are putting on bringing in coaches who not only have coached the run game, but coaches like Dennison who have coached the offensive line for nearly 15 years in the NFL. And then you couple that with Klint Kubiak, John Benton with more than 20 years of experience. This is the 180-degree difference from what we saw last year when the Seahawks hired Ryan Grubb, Scott Huff, and most of that offensive staff was very inexperienced. You've got the opposite this year. You still got some younger coaches, but they've been in the league for quite some time. They've been offensive coordinators like Kubiak has. They've been quarterback coaches like Andrew Janocko has. You've got experienced coaches that have also been around the block for decades, and now Rick Dennison being the latest here. Again, I think this truly is putting the cherry on top when you consider what he's been able to do with run games throughout his time as an offensive coordinator, run game coordinator in the NFL.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that it reminds me of years ago when Seattle was investing, and this is John Schneider's early years. I remember having conversations with some of the members of the Seahawks scouting staff at that point when they were signing Michael Bennett, they were signing Cliff Averill to contracts that were frankly a little bit less than what most were expecting those 2 very accomplished players to get. Now, obviously, those are players. We're talking about coaches here. But to me, it was so exciting to see from a Seahawks perspective that, oh, wow, you are getting good, young, talented players to come in on the cheap just because they're so excited about what John Schneider and Pete Carroll and Russell Wilson are building here in Seattle. To me, it's a very similar situation here with what John Schneider and Mike Macdonald are building. When you talk about the loyalty, the longevity of the Kubiak name, and the fact that you are able to bring in a guy like a Rick Dennison, who at 66 years old, there's a lot of guys who'd be looking at retirement at this point, and you are able to lure them from New Orleans, obviously geographically, the entire other side of the country, all the way up here, the Pacific Northwest. Corbin, again, I think that when you're talking about coaches rather than players, it's harder for a lot of fans to get as excited. But I do think that the Seahawks are basically flipping a switch here. They're recognizing that they don't have to get younger or more physically gifted. They just got to do better on the actual field. And that's where coaching takes precedence here. So for the Seattle go from the oldest coach in the NFL in Pete Carroll, and again, we've talked about so many times, I think that he's a Hall of Famer. I think he's unbelievable. But to go from the oldest coach in the NFL to the youngest coach in the NFL, Mike Macdonald, and to still have the loyalty of coaches just flocking to Seattle to join his staff, I think this is a very exciting day to be a Seahawks fan.
And one other factoid to throw out there, Rick Dennison was the quarterback coach in Baltimore in 2014. That was Mike Macdonald's first season with the Ravens, and he was a coaching intern. So you know that he had a chance to pick Rick Dennison's brain when he was there that season in Baltimore. And oh, by the way, that was also the season that Leslie Frazier was on staff in Baltimore, I believe. So it's all coming together, all that familiarity. You've got plenty of newness, but you've also got that familiarity on this coaching staff, and Rick Dennison just adding to that for Klint Kubiak as another mentor that he can lean on heading into his first season as the offensive coordinator in the Pacific Northwest. When we come back, one of the players that Rick Dennison may have a chance to work with is going to be heading the free agent market. We're going to check out whether Laken Tomlinson has a chance to be back in a Seattle uniform in 2025. We'll get to that coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you could stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into the same game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting from start to finish. Whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or hoping and praying that Steph Curry can hit a game-winning three, I never feel like I've missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com. For your shot at $150 in bonus bets, make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It's time for our next free agency primer. Yesterday, we had a chance to look on the defensive side of the ball at Jarran Reed in the trenches, and now we're going to shift back to the offensive side of the football. And look, we had this discussion a few weeks back. Laken Tomlinson, one of 10 unrestricted free agents for the Seahawks, approaching his 33rd birthday, getting to be an older player, and he had his struggles this season. 38 pressures allowed, 6 sacks allowed in pass protection. Didn't always seem to be on the same page with the run game. There were times he had players in front of him, and then he just didn't seem to get a hand on players. It was an inconsistent season at best. And Rob, you and I were under the impression a month ago that this is going to be one and done for Laken Tomlinson. He will not be back in Seattle. But there's been a hiring that has been made that I'm wondering if maybe it changes that narrative a little bit heading towards free agency, especially with the fact that John Schneider has made it clear, at least publicly, he's saying this, that he's not going to throw a bunch of money at the offensive line or weaknesses to try to fix them in free agency. I'm wondering if John Benton coming in as the offensive line coach who coached Laken Tomlinson in New York a few years back and holds great regard for him, respects the player a lot. I'm wondering if John Benton tells John Schneider, Klint Kubiak and company that, hey, I'd like to have another veteran at the guard spot that can help with teaching my system. And that makes me wonder if there's a chance with Laken Tomlinson not being expensive to re-sign, if he could be back for a second season.
No, I think that he absolutely could. For all the reasons that you just talked about. And for another reason that we have talked about an awful lot is that the Seahawks lack very much veteran leadership. I go back to the opener this past season against the Broncos, and the cameras happened to show Laken Tomlinson as he was walking into the stadium, literally from his car before he had put on his uniform and things like that. And the guy walked in with a vest with no shirt underneath it, and just kind of like the. It just looked like a cowboy wearing straps and the whole thing. I mean, he was trying to prove that he was the guy that was basically going to kind of, forgive me for a lack of not expressing this perfectly, but just jumping onto the back of a Bronco and riding them to victory. That was one of the things that really kind of demonstrated to me that Laken Tomlinson is a guy. He is a leader. He is a tough guy. He wants to be one of the leaders in the locker room. And the fact that he did that, and as you mentioned here with John Benton returning, Seattle's relative youth along the entire offensive line, to me, that is one of the reasons why I think you got to be excited about the possibility of Laken Tomlinson kind of returning, because again, you have an awful lot of youth. You have an offensive guard that seems like forever now has been starting virtually every single game. He started all 17 games for the Seahawks a year ago. As you said, gave up 38 quarterback pressures, which is a scary number. Gave up 6 sacks, which is a scary number. Wasn't as effective in the running game as perhaps he was expected of a guy that has been starting for basically a decade after being a first-round selection. But if you take all of that and throw it out the window and instead just say, what kind of coaching was he getting? What kind of play calling were the Seahawks having at that point? If the Seahawks are convinced that John Benton and that Rick Dennison and that Klint Kubiak, et cetera, can be that much better, then maybe Laken Tomlinson is the leader already in place that Seattle might be looking to spend significant dollars on in free agency or invest a high draft pick. And as you said, John Schneider has been kind of loath to spend an awful lot of money on offensive linemen. I mean, you look at Laken Tomlinson, he signed for $1.2 million a year ago. Now, $1.2 million to a lot of us is still obscene money. But in today's NFL, to start 17 games at $1.2 million at one of the most critical positions on the team, and I definitely believe the offensive lineman is that, then again, that's a basic bargain. And for a Seahawks squad that is up against the cap as much as the Seahawks are, I do think that Laken Tomlinson could be, at least in one perspective, could be viewed as a bargain and somebody that John Benton may very much be trying to talk the Seahawks into retaining.
Let's go to the other side of the coin, though. Look, we've taken the positive standpoint, but I'm going to go back to the reasons why I'm still leaning towards this being a one-and-done situation. Do I think John Benton could be asking for Laken Tomlinson to come back? Absolutely. Could the Seahawks wait till April again like they did last year if Tomlinson's still available and say, hey, veteran minimum, we're going to bring you back in? They could absolutely do that. But there's a few factors here that I think are going to make this a one-and-done scenario. And yes, the coaching may have been part of the equation, but the film, it just looks like a player to me that is well past his prime. That's what jumped out on tape last season. Again, the angles on blocks, the fact that there were times it almost seemed like he was playing Olay like a matador with guys that were in position for him to block and he just didn't get hands on them. I had not seen that from Laken Tomlinson earlier in his career. Now, maybe there was some confusion about the way that they were scheming up plays, But Laken Tomlinson, if he's having issues with that, you've got real problems, because this is one of the smartest offensive linemen in the NFL, a Duke graduate. I mean, this guy is as smart as they come. So I find it hard to believe that there were issues in terms of the scheme. It just seemed like there were too many times that blocks were left on the field, whether in pass protection or run blocking, and he's not getting any younger. I get the price. That could be a reason to bring him back. I get the relationship with John Benton, but we talked about this last week. You look at this year's guard free agent class and the draft class, both are really, really good. They're deep. They're talented. To me, if you're John Schneider, and this is just reiterating what I argued last week, I'm not even saying you need to throw $20 million at Trey Smith. I'm not saying you need to go out and spend that kind of money. But I just don't think there's any excuse for John Schneider to sleepwalk through this free agency period and just lean back on signing Laken Tomlinson with a chance that he's going to be starting for you again next year. I just don't think that that shows any growth by a general manager, to be honest with you. If he is not going to take advantage of this class, this free agency class, where there are a lot of players that are 4, 5, 6 years younger than Laken Tomlinson, that are still in their prime, that played much better last year, and you don't have to give a top dollar contract to sign some of those guys because of the depth that there is in this position. Adding all these things up, and even if you don't sign one of those guys, this is a good draft class at guard, and you've got several young players you're excited about. Aside from the veteran standpoint, if it's an April signing, I get it, but I'm not signing him any quicker than that, and I'm trying to rapidly work through the free agent class and see if I can get an upgrade over what you had from Laken Tomlinson, because I just don't see a scenario where he suddenly turns back the clock and he's playing like he did 4 or 5 years ago. I just don't see it.
I don't see a scenario where he plays the way he did 4 or 5 years ago. I absolutely think that he could play the way he did 2 or 3 years ago, which I still think is a quality starter at the left guard position. Now, if you want to improve, and I think that's what the Seahawks need to do, then as we talked about in last week's show, there are literally 10 different guards in free agency this year that I think would be significant upgrades. And we kind of talked about some of them. I'm just going to name all 10 of them right now that I think would be upgrades over Laken Tomlinson. We talked about Trey Smith, Brandon Scherf from Jacksonville, James Daniels from Pittsburgh, Tevin Jenkins from Chicago, Aaron Banks from San Francisco, Ben Bredesen from Tampa Bay, Mekhi Becton from Philadelphia, Will Henderson from Arizona, Patrick McCarry from Baltimore, and Zach Martin, former or a future Hall of Famer, in my opinion, but still on the end of his career. I think all of those guys could be an upgrade over Laken Tomlinson. However, if John Schneider does what John Schneider has done in the past, and he wants to play the guard game as cheaply as possible, I do think that have there been moves since even last week with the Seahawks retaining or bringing in John Benton, and of course, Rick Dennison hears news today that suggests that Seattle may decide to kind of just play with the hand that they've been dealt and stick with Laken Tomlinson just because they know who he is and they are desperate for some leadership, some durability at the guard position.
This really feels like a 50-50 to me that he would be back. A lot of it is bearing on what happens the first few days of free agency. If the Seahawks actually go out and make a move for a younger guard and spend a little bit of money at that position, then I find it difficult to believe that he's going to be back. But if they go through that and they don't make any significant signings at guard, Tomlinson, I don't expect is going to have teams rushing to sign him. You get to April, veteran minimum deal, minimum guarantees on it. At that point, you have nothing to lose. But I think if the Seahawks are rushing into signing him with some of the options that are out there, I don't think that shows, again, I don't think it shows growth from John Schneider. At some point, you've got to make some adjustments when a process has not worked over and over and over again. So my hope is he's going to do that, at least explore what's out there. And if you have to come back to Laken Tomlinson in April, then you can do that. But to me, this feels like this is kind of an up-in-the-air one, depending on what the Seahawks choose to do at the guard position early in free agency. When we come back, speaking of free agency, we're going to move away from the trenches. We talked about it yesterday. Receiver may be an underrated need for the Seahawks heading into this offseason. We're going to take a look at a handful of receivers set to hit the market that could be intriguing additions to go with DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba. That'll be coming up next year on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. This is your host, Corbin Smith. He is Rob Rang. A special thanks to all the 12s for tuning in. And as always, thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are getting closer and closer to the start of free agency, the legal tampering period beginning on March 12th. So we're really 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks from this thing getting interesting with the start of the NFL offseason. And one position that we talked about yesterday, a non-offensive line position that could be an under-the-radar need for the Seahawks, is undoubtedly the receiver spot. We have yet to hear what's going to happen with Tyler Lockett. The assumption is that at a $30+ million cap hit, that he is going to be a cap casualty. Maybe they agree to a restructured contract where he takes a big pay cut to stay in Seattle. That is still a possibility, though I would say a slim one at this point. Assuming that Lockett's not back, you're going to have DK Metcalf, you're going to have Jackson Smith and Jigba, but there's a big drop-off after those two receivers. Rob, this feels like a positional group that is going to need a jolt in free agency and potentially in the draft as well. They might need to sign a receiver and draft one fairly early come April to try to overhaul a group that, for all the money they spent on this position, you can make an argument was not as good as they should have been last year in Ryan Grubb's offense. The good news is there are some fascinating free agent options out there that shouldn't cost a ton of money.
Yeah, as we just talked about the guard class, I mentioned, rattled off 10 players I thought could be an upgrade over what Seattle has at the either left and right guard. I think that there are some big names out there at the wide receiver position that are certainly going to get Seahawks fans excited. Now, I'm going to mention some names. I don't think that necessarily these players are going to wind up becoming Seahawks, but I still want just to kind of start the conversation by just mentioning names like a T. Higgins, like a Stephon Diggs, like an Amari Cooper, like a DeAndre Hopkins, guys that are Chris Godwin, Keenan Allen. I mean, you just keep on going. I mean, guys that have Pro Bowls next to their names, all pros next to their names that, my goodness, when you just look at the 2 touchdowns that Tyler Lockett had this past season, then it's easy to imagine, oh my goodness, what could happen for the Seahawks if they decide to allocate that, $30.5 million salary cap hit that Tyler Lockett is, at least at this point, is going to have for the Seahawks. What happens if they shifted that money elsewhere? So I think you have to start the conversation there. Now, look, I just being realistic, I think that there's several more players that I think are much more likely fit for the Seahawks, and I'll mention a couple of those guys here. But I also think that this is something the Seahawks have got to address. This is not Laken Tomlinson, a guy who came in on a 1-year deal. There's not a lot of a fan and franchise loyalty to him. We're talking about Tyler Lockett, a guy who is a legend on and off the field, especially in this community. I think that Seattle is going to do whatever they possibly can to try to extend his contract and keep him on the field just because of who he is. And that's the thing, is I don't know if that's actually the right move to make at this point. In New England, they talk about the Patriot way, or at least they used to, about their willingness to cut a player a year or two before you probably should, just because the fact that he is not who he once was. Tyler Lockett is clearly not the all-pro caliber player that he once was. If the Seahawks are committed to winning rather than, just legacy, then I do think that they have to make a move. So again, these are 3 players that are a little bit more realistic. All of them are 28 years old or younger. That is the number I'm always going to be focusing in on when it comes to free agents. And all of them are going to be due contracts that I think are going to be less than what Tyler Lockett's going to get, but at the same time are not the bargain basement, wait till after the draft type of candidates. So to me, I'm going to list them in the order that I personally would rank them. I'm going to go with Josh Palmer, the 25, the youngest of the players, 25-year-old Josh Palmer from the LA Chargers. Now, his ability to play inside the slot as well as outside, at 6'1", 210 pounds, he is a very different player, and of course, than Tyler Lockett. If you want straight line speed, that's something that Tyler Lockett has been able to provide the Seahawks in the past. Darius Slayton, 28 years old from the New York Giants, to me, might be a guy that would make an awful lot of sense. He's probably the most expensive of the 3 players I'm going to mention. And then finally, the troubled child. I mean, and I say that kind of jokingly because at 28 years old, Deontay Johnson is certainly not a child at this point. But my goodness, some of the behavior that I've heard with some of his past stops, he got traded or dropped in this last season. He was on 3 different teams, and not very many of them were very good teams. But Deontay Johnson, who Mike Macdonald has some experience with coaching against when he was with the Pittsburgh Steelers, as well as when he was a member of the Baltimore Ravens, also with Houston, also with Carolina this past year. Of course, the Seahawks have an awful lot of connections to those franchises. They would get some insight into this young man. But still, those are 3 wide receivers that I think have some immediate big play potential that might be able to complement, not to replace a guy like a DK Metcalf or a Jackson Smith-Njigba, but still complement them very well as the speed option over the top.
What I like about this free agent class at receiver is you have several players that are under 26 years of age that I still think have a lot of untapped potential, whether it's been because of injuries or playing on teams where they've had poor quarterback play or a combination of those 2 things. And I think there are a couple guys here that you could plug into Tyler Lockett's spot if you can't agree to a restructured deal. If you could get it to where Tyler Lockett is coming back next year for a cap hit of $10 million or less, I'm all for it because I think he could have done more last year if the offense allowed him to do it. I still think there's some talent there in Tyler Lockett, but he isn't what he used to be. I still think Elijah Moore has the chance to be a really good NFL receiver. When I watch this kid at Ole Miss, just an absolute blur. Big play threat. You could do a lot of things with him. You could run jet sweeps. He could create after the catch. He could burn you downfield. And he's had more issues with quarterback play than any receiver that you can imagine. I mean, he was in New York playing for when Sam Darnold was not the one we saw last year in Minnesota and all the different QBs the Jets have rotated through. He got his way out of New York because he was frustrated with how he was being used there. Goes to Cleveland, and then we know what's happened with their quarterback situation, spending all that money on Deshaun Watson and then the injuries and poor play from Watson. Elijah Moore is still just 25 years old, going to be 25 next month. This guy is still a really young player that has a lot of the same traits that Tyler Lockett had in his prime. He's got that route running ability. I'd even argue he's got a little bit more juice in terms of top line speed. I think Elijah Moore would be a player that you buy low in a 1-year deal that has a chance to really blow up when he's the number 3 receiver with a QB that actually can get him the football consistently, which I think Geno Smith could absolutely do. And staying with the last name Moore, a name that fans are going to be familiar with when he played for the Arizona Cardinals. Rondale Moore was traded to from the Cardinals to the Atlanta Falcons last year, and then unfortunately suffered a severe injury during the preseason. He missed the entire season. His health is going to be the big question mark here. But you want to talk about an absolute jackhammer at the receiver position. I mean, this dude can squat 600 pounds, and he's a tiny little guy. But he's another one of those pocket Hercules like you see with Maurice Jones-Drew at the running back position. He's the pocket Hercules at receiver, and you can do so many different things with him. He has not lived up to expectations as a receiver in the league, but I think that this is another player as the number 3 wideout. Klint Kubiak could have a lot of fun moving him around, assuming that he's healthy. And the last player that I'm going to throw out is another familiar name, Tutu Atwell. The Rams are going to be making some changes in offense because they can't afford to pay everybody. And Atwell was kind of the 4th receiver last season. He made some catches down the stretch, but another guy that's on the smaller end, he's built like Tyler Lockett, even a little smaller than Lockett, but has the ability to win over the top. He's made some big plays in the Seahawks, still a very young player. That's one of those you take away from a rival and help your own team type situations. And Atwell also has some ability to return kicks that the Rams haven't fully taken advantage of. But there are some reasons to think that he and Rondale Moore could both contribute on special teams in that capacity. All 3 of those players are 26 and younger. Again, injuries, poor quarterback play, some inconsistent performance. I don't expect any of those guys are going to get big paydays, but they could be really good value signings as number 3 receivers in Seattle if Tyler Lockett indeed is no longer in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think is kind of like the takeaway of this conversation is that there are a lot of speed receivers, young speed receivers who are available in free agency. And while this draft class, I would argue, is better in the middle rounds than it is at the, in the first round when it comes to wide receiver, there definitely are more candidates to replace even a legend like Tyler Lockett than perhaps there might be at, say, linebacker or along at the edge rusher positions, two of the positions that we've talked about a little bit in the past.
As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, we're going to continue our free agent primers. We're going to shift over to the defensive line. We've got another big man that could be back with the Seahawks or could be allowed to walk in Jonathan Hankins. We'll discuss the possibilities that he returns in 2025, and we'll continue our roundtable of free agency, staying on the offense side of the football, checking out some tight ends that could make some sense for the Seahawks. Make sure that you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday night. Go Hawks.